I was 34 when I decided to take a solo camping trip out to the Olympic Peninsula in Washington state. It was October of 2019, and I had just gone through a rough patch. My job at the auto parts warehouse in Tacoma had burned me out, and my girlfriend of 4 years had moved out a few months earlier. The lease on our apartment was almost up. I had some savings built up, and I figured I could afford a few weeks off to reset and clear my head before figuring out the next step. I'd always enjoyed being out in the woods. Something about the quiet and the way the air smelled, like moss and earth and old pine, helped me breathe easier. So I packed up my old Ford Ranger with a canvas tent, some gear, a sleeping bag, a Jetboil stove, 2 weeks of food, and a weather radio. I also brought my Ruger .22 rifle, more out of habit than real fear, since I wasn't planning on hunting or anything. I didn't even plan to stay near other people. I wanted to be alone. I didn't pick a campsite from a guidebook. Instead, I used a mix of paper maps and Google Earth before I left to find a patch of forest that looked remote enough without being totally inaccessible. There was a service road just south of Lake Quinault that twisted its way up a ridge into the denser parts of the woods, and about 5 miles in, there was a flat clearing that looked big enough to pitch a tent. It wasn't an official campsite, but that was fine with me. I wasn't going out there for picnic tables and fire rings. The road was rough, just gravel and dirt, mostly washed out in parts. My truck barely made it through some of the turns without sliding, but I took it slow. When I finally got to the clearing, the sun was already starting to dip behind the trees. The place was perfect, silent except for the wind in the branches. No signs of people anywhere. I set up camp in the center of the clearing. I didn't bother with a campfire since the ground was damp, and I figured I'd just eat dehydrated meals with the stove. The first 2 days were calm. It drizzled off and on, and the trees kept most of the rain off. I spent my time hiking out in different directions during the day, always careful to mark my trail with orange ribbon and check my compass. I saw a couple of deer and even a black bear at a distance, but nothing too close. At night, I listened to the rain tap against the nylon walls of the tent and felt more peace than I'd felt in months. I didn't see a single person the whole time, but the third night was different. That afternoon, the weather shifted. The wind picked up. The sky had a low, leaden look to it. Thicker clouds rolling in, darker than before. The air smelled sharp like metal. I heard no birds. That usually meant a real storm was coming. So I packed all my gear into sealed dry sacks and tightened down the rainfly on the tent. I even dug a shallow trench around the base of it with my camp shovel to keep water from running underneath. The rain started heavy around dusk. It wasn't a sprinkle anymore. It was full-on sheets of rain pouring down in the trees. It hit the tent hard and constant, like handfuls of pebbles. I climbed into my sleeping bag, zipped everything tight, and lay there listening. The ground below me stayed dry thanks to the tarp I'd laid underneath, but the wind was strong enough to make the sides of the tent ripple. Somewhere around 10 or 11 that night, I heard something that cut through the sound of the storm. A thud, not a branch falling. I know what that sounds like, random snapping, followed by a thump. This was dull, solid, like someone had dropped something heavy into the mud just outside the tent. I held my breath, listening. The rain hadn't let up, and the wind was still moving the trees, but I could swear I heard footsteps in the muck. Slow, wet, like boots pulling free from the ground. I didn't move. I just stared at the dark fabric above me. I didn't turn on my flashlight. I didn't even breathe loud. My rifle was propped up against the inside corner of the tent, just within reach. My hand crept toward it. I stayed still for a long time, maybe half an hour. Eventually, I told myself it had to be a deer or something, maybe a bear rooting around. I didn't keep food outside the bear bag, so I figured nothing should attract them. Still, I kept the rifle next to me and didn't sleep much the rest of the night. When morning came, the rain was still falling but lighter. I crawled out of the tent and looked around. There were footprints, Not animal tracks, real human boot prints. In the mud just a few feet from my tent entrance. Deep impressions. Big, probably men's size 11s or 12s. The pattern on the sole looked like those cheap department store work boots. They weren't mine. I checked against the tread on my own boots. These were different. The prints came in from the north tree line and stopped about 10 feet from the tent, turned around, and went back the same way. No sign of anything else. No trash, no broken branches. Just the prints. I stood there a long time just staring. Felt wrong. Someone had come out into the woods in the middle of a thunderstorm, walked up to my tent, then left. Didn't call out, didn't light a flashlight, just stood there, watched. I don't know. That's what it felt like. I packed everything up fast, stuffed the wet tent into a bin, didn't even try to fold it right. My plan was to hike out to the truck, get back to the highway, and go home. I didn't make it that far. About 2 miles down the service road, I found a tree fallen across the path. It had come down during the night, wide enough and heavy enough that there was no way I was moving it on my own. I got out of the truck, stood in the rain, and stared at it, cursing under my breath. I wasn't even sure I could turn the Ranger around on the narrow stretch of road I was on. But I didn't want to stay out there. I definitely didn't want to sleep another night in that spot. So I did a 10-point turn, almost slid the rear end off the embankment once, and barely got the truck turned around. I figured I'd backtrack and try another path, maybe a forest road that looped around east. That's when I noticed it. Another set of boot prints, right near where I had gotten out of the truck. Fresh, less than an hour old, judging by the way the rain hadn't totally filled them in yet. They came from the woods and disappeared into the trees on the other side of the road. Same tread pattern as before. I didn't say anything out loud. I just got back in the truck, locked the doors, and drove. I kept my eyes on the rear view the whole time. It was hard to explain, but I felt watched. Not just like something could be nearby, but like someone was waiting, maybe just off the road, watching me move. I found a wider turnout and pulled off to check my maps. There was a trail that curved east and eventually met up with another service road, but it would take hours to get through. It was almost noon by then, and I knew I wouldn't make it out before dark. Still, I wasn't going to turn around. I started hiking the trail on foot first to see if the truck could handle it. It was overgrown in places but manageable. No signs of recent traffic, no tire tracks, no boot prints. That made me feel a little better. I got the truck through the first part fine. I had to stop a few times to move rocks and branches. The rain picked up again just before sunset. The trail widened into a dry patch beneath a rock overhang, and I decided to camp there. It was elevated and better protected from the wind. I didn't bother with the tent. I just spread my sleeping bag in the truck bed, under the canopy, and kept the rifle loaded next to me. I didn't eat, didn't even take off my boots. I just laid there, eyes open, listening. Around midnight, I heard the same sound again. Thud. This time it was closer, and not from the ground. It sounded like a hand slapping against the side of the truck. I froze. I didn't breathe. The rain had muffled everything, but I was sure I heard it again. Just one solid thunk on the metal panel near the tailgate. I waited, hand gripping the rifle tight. Then the truck rocked. Just once. Not like the wind pushed it. More like something had leaned or pressed against it, hard. I didn't get out. I didn't move. I waited for hours, eyes locked on the back window of the canopy, watching for any shape, any shadow. Nothing else happened that night. By dawn, it was quiet again. When I finally stepped out, everything was still wet and gray, but there were no prints this time. No marks. Nothing I could prove. But I knew I hadn't imagined it. I didn't stop moving after that. I drove straight until I hit the next road. Didn't even pause to eat. I got out of the forest by mid-afternoon and pulled into a gas station on Route 101. I didn't tell anyone what happened. Who would I tell? The cops? I didn't have a name, didn't see a face. All I had was a gut feeling and a couple of boot prints. Nothing illegal about hiking near someone's camp, technically. But I knew what I felt. Someone had followed me, watched me. They hadn't tried to rob me. They didn't shout or ask for help. They didn't take anything. They just came and stood there in the dark, in the rain, waiting for something. I went home, washed all the gear, and packed it away in the basement. I didn't camp again for over a year. Even now, when I do go, I don't go alone. And I don't stray off the marked trails anymore. That trip taught me something I'll never forget. The scariest thing out in the woods isn't bears or mountain lions. It's people. People with no reason to be where they are. People who don't want anything from you, except maybe to scare you. Or worse, I never found out who it was or what they wanted. And that's what still keeps me up some nights. It was early October 2021. I was 29 and working remotely from my apartment in Flagstaff, Arizona. I'd been spending way too much time indoors, so I planned a solo camping trip to clear my head. I picked a spot about 3 hours northeast, near a lake I'd never visited before, Blue Ridge Reservoir. I figured since it was a weekday, it wouldn't be busy. I didn't want company, just a few days of quiet, nature, and no one talking to me. I needed that. I packed my gear on a Tuesday morning. My old black Jeep Cherokee was already half loaded from past trips. Tent, sleeping pad, propane stove, folding chair, and the rest. I grabbed a couple gallons of water, some Mountain House meals, peanut butter, trail mix, and a 6-pack of beer for the cooler. My .22 rifle came with me too. I wasn't planning to hunt, but I always took it on solo trips, mostly for peace of mind. It took me just over 3 hours to reach the general area, bouncing down a washboard forest road that rattled everything inside the Jeep. Eventually, I found a spot about a quarter-mile off the road, hidden enough by trees that nobody would see my tent unless they walked right up to it. I liked it that way. The trees there were mostly tall pines, with some brushy undergrowth around the edges. The lake was down a slope, maybe 5 minutes from where I parked. There weren't any other cars or people around, at least not that I saw. I set up my tent on a patch of dry pine needles, got my little cook table unfolded, and unrolled my sleeping bag inside the tent. By the time I finished, the shadows were already long. The air smelled like cold sap and dry dirt. That first night was uneventful. I heated up some chili, ate it while sitting on my camp chair, and then read a paperback for a while using my headlamp. Around 9 p.m., I crawled into my sleeping bag, zipped it all the way up, and listened to the wind moving through the trees. Coyotes howled once or twice in the distance, but that was it. I fell asleep fast. The next morning, I walked down to the lake with my coffee. It was smooth as glass, completely still, with a light fog hovering right above the surface. I sat on a flat rock for maybe an hour, watching the sun push through the pines. I didn't see or hear a single boat, person, or even an airplane the entire time. That second day, I hiked around for a while, staying within about 2 miles of my camp. I came across a small dry creek bed that looked like it might carry water during the spring runoff. It curved around the base of a steep hill, with a lot of rocks and dead branches piled up. There were some old boot prints in the dirt, probably from months ago. Some looked small, almost like a kid's, but I didn't think too much of it. People brought their kids camping out here all the time. I made a mental note of the spot in case I needed to gather firewood or just explore more later. By late afternoon, I was back at camp. I cracked a beer and boiled water for one of those freeze-dried meals, beef stroganoff, I think. It was colder that night. I built a small fire in a rock ring I'd put together earlier and sat close to it as the light drained from the forest. I could hear small things moving in the underbrush, probably squirrels or rabbits. The woods always came alive right at dusk. Just before I turned in for the night, I thought I heard a stick break from somewhere out in the trees. Not close, but not far either. I froze for a second, holding my breath. It was nothing at first. Then I heard another crunch. Could have been a deer, maybe even a bear, though I didn't see any scat or signs around. I held on to my flashlight and rifle a little tighter that night. I kept both right next to me in the tent. The third day was when things started to feel strange. I woke up just after 6 a.m., cold and stiff, but nothing out of place in camp. I boiled coffee and made some instant oatmeal. Then I walked the same loop around the area as before. When I passed that creek bed again, I noticed something new. There was a footprint in the soft dirt near the edge of the slope, a fresh one. It was definitely not mine. Too large, too deep. My boots were a size 10, and this one looked at least a size or two bigger. And it wasn't one of those heavy tread hiking boots either. It was flat-soled, maybe a work boot or something similar. I bent down and looked closer. It hadn't been rained on or dried up. It had to have been made within the last few hours. That meant someone else was out here. I stood there for a while, trying to hear something. The forest was dead quiet. Not even birds. That silence didn't sit right with me. I headed back to camp, taking a longer way through the trees just to make sure I wasn't being followed. I saw nothing. Still, my gut told me to be more alert. I loaded the rifle that afternoon and kept it within arm's reach the rest of the day. Nothing else happened until after dark. I was in my sleeping bag, reading with my headlamp on low, when I heard what sounded like metal hitting metal outside the tent. A light clink like a pan being bumped. I froze. Every hair on my arms stood up. My mess kit was inside my Jeep, but the little propane burner had been left out on the table. I turned off my light and slowly unzipped the tent, just enough to look through the mesh. The woods were pitch black, but the moon was out, and I could make out the shapes of the trees and my table about 20 feet away. Nothing moved. I waited for what felt like 10 minutes, my heart hammering in my chest. Then I heard it again, a faint scrape. I swung the tent flap open all the way and scanned the site with my flashlight. Nobody, nothing, but my burner had been moved. It was on its side now, not how I left it. I walked over slowly, scanning everything. I didn't see any footprints or signs of an animal. The forest was dead silent again. That bothered me more than anything else. I went back into the tent, didn't sleep much, and kept my rifle right on my chest the whole night. The next morning, I decided I was going to cut the trip short. I didn't like the feeling out there anymore. I couldn't explain it, but something was wrong. I boiled coffee fast and skipped breakfast. Just as I was packing up the tent, I noticed something else. There was a small strip of white cloth tied around a branch about 30 feet from my sight. It hadn't been there before. It looked like it had been torn off a t-shirt or maybe a sheet. It was knotted once and just dangling. That was enough for me. I loaded the Jeep as fast as I could. My heart was racing the whole time. Felt like someone was watching me. I kept scanning the woods, expecting to see a person standing out there. But there was nothing. I put the last of my gear in and slammed the hatch shut. When I got into the driver's seat and turned the key, the engine wouldn't turn over. I froze. I tried again. Nothing. Just a click. I popped the hood and ran around front. My battery cables were intact. Everything looked normal. I checked the battery terminals. Someone had loosened the positive cable, just enough that the connection wouldn't hold. It didn't come loose on its own. I always check that stuff before a trip. My hands were shaking as I tightened it back with a multi-tool. Once it was snug, I tried the engine again. It roared to life like normal. I drove out fast, bouncing hard over the road, the suspension groaning the whole way. I didn't care. I just needed to get out. I didn't stop until I hit the highway. When I looked in the rearview mirror one last time before turning onto the pavement, I thought I saw something or someone step behind a tree far down the road. I never went back to Blue Ridge Reservoir. I never reported it. What could I say? No one actually did anything to me. I wasn't hurt. Nothing was taken. But someone had been watching me. Someone followed me out there. They stayed quiet, moved things around, marked the woods, tried to make sure I couldn't leave. I don't know what they wanted. I don't want to know. Now, when I camp, I don't go alone anymore. I don't stray far from where other people are. And I always check my gear twice, especially the engine. People think the scariest things in the woods are animals or ghosts. But that's not true. The scariest thing in the forest is another person you didn't know was there. And I know because one time I wasn't alone. Not really. Back in the fall of 2013, I was 29 and going through one of those restless phases people don't really talk about much. I had quit my job at a local mechanic shop in Charleston, West Virginia, after 6 years, not because I hated it or anything, but because I couldn't stand the feeling that every day was going to be the same until I died. My long-term girlfriend and I had split up earlier that summer, and most of my friends were either married or had kids, so I found myself drifting. I needed to get out and feel something again. I'd always liked camping, especially alone. It was one of the few things that cleared my head. I figured a few nights out in the hills might reset me. I heard about a place from this guy I used to work with, Graveyard Ridge. It wasn't an actual graveyard, not officially, but people said it got the name because there was an old Civil War burial spot somewhere up there. No headstones, just mounds covered over by trees and time. Nobody had been buried up there in over a century, but folks avoided it just the same. It sat about 2 hours south of Charleston, near a town called Glen Fork. He said his uncle used to hunt deer up that way and mentioned it was remote enough that you could go a whole weekend without seeing another soul. That's what I was looking for. Silence, seclusion, space to let my brain breathe. I loaded up my gear in my old Toyota Tacoma, tossed in a couple days worth of food, water, my old tent, and a .22 rifle I kept more out of habit than need. I set off early on a Friday morning, taking the back roads to avoid traffic. It was cool and gray, just the kind of weather I liked for hiking. By the time I reached the base of the ridge, it was around noon. I parked at the end of a dirt access road near an old gate that looked like it hadn't been opened in years. From there, it was a couple miles hike to the top. The trail wasn't marked, but I had a printed topo map and my GPS, and the guy at work had roughly drawn a route that would take me along the ridge where the supposed burial mounds were. The air was thick with the smell of decaying leaves, and the forest was quiet aside from the occasional rustle of something moving through the underbrush, probably squirrels or raccoons. Still, I kept glancing over my shoulder. Something about the silence didn't sit right with me. It was a little too quiet. After a good 90 minutes of hiking, I reached a flat area near the top of the ridge. It opened into a clearing maybe 50 feet wide, surrounded on 3 sides by dense woods. The 4th side dropped off into a steep ravine. That's where I decided to make camp. The spot had a natural windbreak, soft pine needles covering the ground, and a perfect view out toward the valley. I figured if this was Graveyard Ridge, it wasn't a bad final resting place. I set up my tent near a cluster of large rocks, then gathered firewood from the surrounding area. While doing that, I noticed a few strange mounds, evenly spaced, maybe 10 feet apart, covered in moss and leaves. They were subtle, nothing dramatic, but something about how they lined up caught my eye. They didn't look natural. I told myself it was just the way water had flowed over time, or maybe roots shifting underneath. By sundown, I had a small fire going. I ate some instant noodles and jerky, then sat staring into the flames as darkness crept in. The sky clouded over, and the stars disappeared. A light wind came through the trees, bringing with it a sudden drop in temperature. I layered up, tossed a few more sticks on the fire and leaned back against my pack. Then I heard it, a soft, slow thud. It wasn't close, but it wasn't far either. Somewhere off in the woods, maybe 50 yards out. It didn't sound like an animal. It sounded deliberate. I turned off my headlamp and listened. Nothing, just the wind again. I waited 10 minutes, then 20, but no other sound came. I told myself it could have been a branch falling or even a deer stepping on something. But still, I slept with the .22 next to me in the tent that night, and I kept waking up every hour, checking my watch, listening. Around 3 a.m., I had finally drifted off into something close to real sleep when I heard the same sound again. This time it was louder and closer. Thud, not like footsteps, not quite. It was heavier, like something being dragged and then dropped. I sat up slowly in the tent and turned off my sleeping bag zipper as quietly as I could. The fire had burned low, but there were still glowing embers. I grabbed my flashlight and unzipped the tent flap just enough to peek out. I didn't see anything at first, just the trees swaying a little and the edge of the clearing bathed in gray moonlight. Then I saw something, just past the fire, maybe 30 feet from the tent. There was a dark shape. It wasn't moving. It looked like a person hunched down near one of the mounds. My stomach sank. I stayed frozen, barely breathing. The shape didn't do anything for what felt like minutes. I blinked a few times, unsure if my eyes were playing tricks on me. I turned the flashlight on and pointed it in that direction. Nothing, just leaves and rocks. The shape was gone. I stepped outside the tent with the rifle, heart hammering in my chest, and slowly walked over to where I thought I saw it. I found nothing, no footprints, no disturbed leaves, no sign that anyone had been there. The woods were still. The only sound was the crackle of a few dying coals in the fire. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. I sat up by the fire with the rifle across my lap, ears straining to hear every creak and whisper of the woods around me. At dawn, I packed up and hiked out, but something stopped me about halfway back to the truck. Along the trail, maybe a quarter mile from where I'd camped, I found what looked like a fresh scrape on a tree about shoulder height. It was wide, maybe 3 inches across, and the bark had been peeled clean off in a vertical line. Below it, I saw scuff marks in the dirt, like something heavy had been dragged. The trail veered slightly downhill there, and whatever it was had disturbed the leaves and left a faint trail into the brush. I followed it, just for a bit. About 50 feet off the main path, I found a shallow depression in the ground. Not a hole, not really, but a place where the dirt had been recently turned. There was a torn piece of faded fabric caught on a branch nearby. Looked like it had once been part of a jacket. I stood there for a while, staring, and then slowly backed away. I didn't tell anyone about it when I got back to town. What would I say? That I saw a shape in the dark and some scuffed dirt in the woods? That I camped on top of old graves and maybe wasn't alone? People would laugh or think I was trying to be spooky. I looked up missing persons reports from the county that week, but didn't find anything that matched what I'd seen. But here's the part that stuck with me the most. A week later, I took my truck in to get the tires rotated at the same shop I used to work at. One of the younger guys there was telling me about some trouble they'd had up by Glen Fork. Someone breaking into hunting cabins, stealing canned food and supplies, leaving weird scratch marks on doors. The sheriff thought it might be a drifter living rough in the woods. They hadn't caught anyone, though. It made my blood go cold. I didn't go camping alone for a long time after that. Even now, 12 years later, I think about that night sometimes. About the shape near the fire. About the sound. The fabric caught in the branch. The scuff marks. I don't know who or what I was near that night, but I know I wasn't alone on Graveyard Ridge. And I know that whatever was out there wasn't just passing through. It was living there, watching, waiting, and it didn't want me there. So I left, and I never went back, and I never will. It was October 2021 when I drove out to the San Juan Mountains in southwestern Colorado to do some elk hunting. I had just turned 33, and that year had been rough. My job was draining, my relationship had ended a few months earlier, and I needed a break from everything. I've hunted all my life. My dad got me into it as a kid in Minnesota. Since moving to Colorado 6 years ago, I'd done a few solo backcountry trips, but this time I wanted to go further and stay out longer. The plan was to camp out in the wilderness for 5 or 6 days, maybe a week if the weather held up. I'd picked a spot about 20 miles west of Lake City, tucked between some dense forest and rugged ridges. It wasn't a marked trailhead or anything, just some overgrown Forest Service road that led into miles of timber and steep terrain. I'd studied maps for weeks beforehand and marked out a few game trails, water sources, and some clearings where elk were likely to graze. It seemed like a perfect place. Quiet, remote, and tough to reach. I had all my gear ready. Rifle, sleeping bag, stove, freeze-dried meals, enough water filters to last me a month if needed. I had a Garmin GPS with emergency SOS, but I rarely checked it unless I had to. I liked the quiet, liked being disconnected. The drive out from Montrose took about 2.5 hours. I got to the dirt road in the early afternoon, locked my truck behind a patch of trees, and started hiking in with a 60-pound pack on my back. By dusk, I'd covered about 6 miles on foot and reached the first ridge I had planned to camp near. I pitched my tent in a small clearing under some spruce trees. There was a little stream about 200 yards downhill, which made it a good spot. I set up camp, boiled some water, and ate a Mountain House chili mac under the stars. The first night was cold but peaceful. I didn't hear much except for the wind rustling the treetops and a few distant owl calls. I slept well and woke before dawn. That first day, I didn't see any elk, but I spotted plenty of signs. Tracks, fresh scat, rubbed up trees. I glassed a couple of high meadows and marked a few spots to return to the next day. The terrain was rough, lots of downed trees and steep inclines, but I liked that. Kept most people out. On the second night, something woke me up. It was just past 1 a.m. I had my watch clipped inside the tent. I wasn't sure what it was at first. A branch cracking maybe, or a rustle in the brush. I sat up and unzipped the tent slightly to listen. Nothing, just wind. I laid back down, pulled the sleeping bag over my shoulders, and eventually drifted off again. Day 3, I hiked to a basin about 2 miles southwest from my camp. It was hard going, a lot of climbing, thick underbrush, but the views were beautiful. Around noon, I spotted my first elk, 3 cows and a bull in the distance across a ridge, too far for a clean shot. I watched them through my scope until they disappeared into the timber. I spent the rest of that afternoon tracking them, but I lost the trail in some rocky terrain. Still, I was encouraged. They were here and I had time. I made it back to camp around 5 p.m., sore and tired. That night, I boiled up some more food, logged the day in my small notebook, and crawled into the tent as the temperature dropped fast. I don't know what time it was when I woke up that night, but I woke up fast, like something jolted me from sleep. It was dead quiet. No wind, no owls, nothing. That kind of silence that makes your ears ring. Then I heard it, slow crunching. Not a twig snapping, but steady footsteps. I held my breath. My rifle was beside me in the tent, always loaded when I was out alone. I reached for it quietly and stayed still, listening. The footsteps stopped just outside the tent. Whoever or whatever it was didn't move for what felt like forever. Then I heard the faintest shuffle, like someone adjusting their weight. I clicked off the safety. My heart was pounding. After about a minute, the sound moved off, crunching leaves, fading slowly. I waited another half hour before I dared unzip the tent. Nothing was there. No light, no movement, just that oppressive silence. I didn't sleep much after that. I kept my rifle close and my boots on inside the bag. At dawn, I stepped outside and looked for tracks. There were a few marks in the dirt and pine needles near the edge of camp. Could have been boot prints, could have been a bear, but they were too indistinct to tell. I couldn't shake the feeling, though. Something had walked right up to my tent and stood there. I told myself it was just an animal, maybe a curious deer, maybe a black bear sniffing around. But I'd camped too many nights in too many wild places to know that wasn't how animals behaved. They skitter off, they don't linger like that. I debated packing up and heading back, but the weather was still good, and I hadn't gotten a shot yet. I moved camp that day, about a mile east along a higher ridgeline. It was more exposed but gave me better visibility and a better shot at tracking elk through the valley below. I spent the whole next day hunting and didn't see a thing, not even fresh sign. It felt like the woods had emptied out overnight. That evening, I was walking back toward camp when I saw something in the distance, a thin column of smoke rising straight up from the trees across the basin. Not mine. I knew where I'd camped, and this was maybe a mile south of that. The smoke was faint, and the wind was calm. Someone else was out here, but I hadn't seen another soul in 4 days. No tire tracks, no camps, nothing. Still, it wasn't impossible. Maybe another hunter. Maybe someone else had bushwhacked in. Back at camp, I made dinner and kept glancing in that direction. I couldn't see the smoke anymore, just dark trees and the early pink of sunset behind them. I didn't sleep well. Around midnight, I thought I heard movement again. Not as close this time, but I couldn't shake the feeling I wasn't alone out there, like someone was circling my camp at a distance, just out of sight. On the 5th day, I went down toward where I'd seen the smoke. There was no trail, just thick timber and underbrush. I spent nearly 4 hours bushwhacking toward the area, but I didn't find any sign of a fire or another camp. No ash, no footprints, no disturbed ground. I started heading back. That's when I realized I was being followed. It wasn't just paranoia. Every time I stopped, I heard something stop too. Every time I moved, I heard distant movement, sticks snapping, faint rustling, like someone trying to stay just far enough back. I didn't call out. I didn't run. I just kept a steady pace and took the long way back to camp. I stayed alert, rifle in hand, eyes constantly scanning the trees. That night, I built a fire and stayed up until nearly 3 a.m. No movement, no noise, just the occasional crackle of flame and the sound of my own heartbeat. I didn't even get in the tent. I sat with my back to a tree, blanket around my shoulders, rifle across my knees. I was done hunting. I was ready to leave at first light. I broke down camp as soon as the sun was up and packed my gear fast. The hike out was brutal. My legs were shot, and the extra adrenaline had left me shaky. I took a more direct route than the one I'd come in on, bushwhacking across a ridge that cut 2 miles off the trip. It was steep, full of loose rocks and thick trees, but I wanted to be out. Around mid-afternoon, I reached the road where I'd parked. My truck was still there, untouched, but something had changed. On the back window, someone had drawn a large X with what looked like ash or dirt. Just one big crude X across the glass. My hands went cold. I looked around the trees, no movement, no sound. I got in the truck, locked the doors, and drove. I didn't stop until I got to Montrose. I told a ranger at the local BLM office what I saw. He took notes but said unless there was a crime, there wasn't much they could do. I filed a report just in case. I showed him a picture of the mark on the truck window. He just frowned and said it was probably some messed up prank. But I know what I felt out there. I know someone was following me, watching me. That wasn't just some hunter or camper. I've been doing this a long time, and I've never felt anything like that in the woods before. It wasn't supernatural, nothing like that. Just a person. Some sick, quiet person who knew the area better than I did and wanted me to know I wasn't welcome. I haven't gone back to that part of Colorado since. I still hunt, but not alone. Not anymore. It was early October 2021 when I decided to take some time off work. I was 34 back then, single, and working remotely as a freelance systems technician out of Pittsburgh. I needed to get away from screens for a while. Things had been piling up, mental clutter mostly. Nothing dramatic. I just needed silence, fresh air, and maybe a few cold nights in the woods. I hadn't done any solo camping in a while, and the Allegheny National Forest in northwestern Pennsylvania was always my go-to. It was close enough to home, but remote enough that you could go a whole weekend without hearing another person's voice. And that's what I wanted. I packed light, tent, sleeping bag, my knife, bear spray, a few MREs, 2 jugs of water, a water filter, a couple granola bars, a small cook set, flashlight, headlamp, power bank, and my Ruger .22 I kept mostly for peace of mind. I wasn't expecting any problems. I knew the woods. I knew how to camp alone. I'd done it plenty of times. And I'd even been to this exact area before, back in 2016 with an old friend of mine who'd moved out of state. The area was south of Kellettville, tucked off a barely used service road that peeled away from Route 66 and wound through a mix of dense pine and hardwoods. The spot wasn't on any official maps, but it was flat, near a shallow creek, and had a soft bed of pine needles covering the forest floor. That part of the forest had a thick, overgrown feeling to it, like everything was just a little too untouched, the kind of place that felt forgotten. I arrived around 3:45 p.m. after a 3-hour drive. The last couple miles of road were rough, more like a memory of a road than anything paved, but I made it fine. Parked the truck near a stand of old birch, slung on my pack, and hiked in about 20 minutes until I reached the spot. Same clearing as before. The creek still ran a few dozen feet off to the west. Same big moss-covered rocks, same logs, same feeling of isolation. I set up camp quickly. The tent went up easy. I gathered some dead branches and small logs from nearby and made a modest fire pit, though fire restrictions were in place, so I knew I wouldn't light anything until after sundown, and even then, I'd keep it small. I boiled some water on my little stove, ate one of the MREs, and watched the sun start dropping behind the hills. There was a kind of golden hush settling over the forest, that long, slow light of October that feels like it's stretching the last bit of warmth out of the year. I remember thinking, asterisk, this is what I needed, star. That first night passed quietly. I read a few chapters of a book on my phone, listened to the sounds of crickets and the distant rush of the creek. I heard a few coyotes somewhere off, miles away, nothing threatening. I slept light, as I always do on solo trips, but I wasn't bothered by anything. I even woke up once around 2 a.m. and poked my head out of the tent. The moonlight was so bright I didn't need a flashlight. Everything was still, cold, beautiful. The next morning, I hiked a few miles to the south with my day pack and came across some deer trails and what looked like old logging tracks. I found a rusted-out piece of farming equipment off in the brush, something ancient and half-buried. Might have been a thresher or plow. It reminded me how old these woods were and how many people had lived and worked out here generations ago. That part of Pennsylvania is full of that kind of forgotten history. Entire towns wiped off the map after the mills closed or the timber dried up. Now it's just ruins under vines. On the way back, maybe half a mile from my site, I passed by a part of the forest I didn't remember. Not exactly a trail, but a thin path worn into the earth. Probably a game trail, I thought. I looked down it and felt this brief chill, like a small thread of unease pulled tight across my chest. Not fear, just something that made my skin tighten. I kept walking. I chalked it up to being alone, my mind making shapes out of nothing. By the time I got back to my tent, the sun was already starting to dip again. I cooked up some oatmeal, cleaned up, and settled into another quiet evening. That's when the first thing happened. I was sitting on a log maybe 20 feet from my tent, eating. I just finished boiling water and was letting the oatmeal cool. The sun was down, but it wasn't pitch black yet. That blue-gray dusk was just giving way to darkness. That's when I heard something move in the brush behind me. It wasn't a deer. I know what deer sound like, sharp, stomping steps, then they usually bolt. This was slower, more deliberate. I froze and turned. My headlamp wasn't on yet. The fire wasn't lit. I couldn't see much, but I stared into the trees and listened. Whatever it was, it stopped moving. Dead quiet. No wind. Just me, my breath, and that awful sense that something had been watching me. I stood up slowly, walked to my tent, and grabbed my flashlight. Swung the beam into the woods in wide sweeps. Nothing. Just trees and underbrush. I told myself it was a raccoon or porcupine. Something small. But I noticed something else too. The normal nighttime sounds had stopped.
No insects. No frogs.
Just dead quiet. Eventually, the noise came back. A cricket here, a distant owl call. I forced myself to settle down. I lit a tiny fire and sat beside it until late. Slept with my bear spray and pistol within reach. That night, I woke up twice. Once at 1:30, again at 4 o'clock. Both times, it felt like something had disturbed the air outside the tent. No sound, no definite movement, but the kind of wakefulness that doesn't come from dreams. My body just knew. I didn't look out the second time. I just lay there, heart thudding, until the gray light of morning finally crept in. I should have left that morning. That's the part one keep coming back to. Everything in me told me it was time to go, but I stayed. I told myself I was being paranoid. I planned for 3 nights, and it was only night 2. I didn't want to feel like I'd backed out over nothing.
Breathe.
That's all it was. Just dumb, stubborn pride. I spent the day near camp. Didn't wander far. I made sure everything was packed and ready, just in case. I even moved my tent closer to a rocky outcrop so I had more visibility. That evening, as I boiled water again and sat with my back to a boulder, I noticed something down by the creek. It looked like bark had been stripped from one of the trees. A long, vertical patch, almost as if someone had peeled it away. I hadn't seen that the day before. Could have missed it, but it caught my attention.
I walked over.
The bark looked fresh. Maybe it had been scraped by an animal. Maybe not. I looked closer. There were faint marks below it, like someone had dragged something through the dirt. Not deep, but not natural either. A weird pattern, almost like boot tread, only too narrow. That night, I barely slept. I heard noises again, closer this time. Something breathing maybe 20 feet from the tent. I didn't move. I didn't unzip the tent. I just lay there with my hand around the pistol grip, staring at the roof of the nylon and counting the seconds. Whatever it was, it stayed for a long time. I could feel it there. I don't know how else to explain it. Eventually, it left. I never heard it go. I only knew that, suddenly, I could breathe again. When the sun rose, I didn't waste time. I packed up fast and made my way back to the truck. Every step felt heavier than the last. I kept glancing over my shoulder. Nothing. But that didn't mean I was alone. When I got to the truck, I noticed something I hadn't before. There were drag marks near the tailgate. Not from me, not from gear. They came from the woods and stopped about 5 feet from the truck. Like something or someone had crouched there for a while. I checked everything. No sign of damage. No missing items. But the ground told its own story. I got in, locked the doors, and drove out fast, bumping over that rough old road, the branches scraping the sides of the truck. I didn't breathe easy until I was past the main highway and a good 20 miles out. I didn't tell anyone right away, not because I thought they wouldn't believe me. There wasn't anything supernatural or mysterious. It was all real. physical. Something was out there, or someone, but because I couldn't explain it clearly, it was just unease, danger without a face. I later read a report online about old poacher trails and illegal hunting cabins hidden deep in that section of the forest. Some had been abandoned decades ago, others maybe not. There were even stories of squatters or hermits living off-grid, some harmless, others not so much. Whatever was out there, I don't think it wanted to hurt me. Not exactly, but it didn't want me there, and it made sure I knew it. I haven't been back to Allegheny since. I still camp, but never alone, never that deep, and I never ignore my gut anymore. When the forest goes quiet like that, when something makes your skin crawl, it's not just imagination. Sometimes it means you're not as alone as you think. It was October of 2017, and I was living alone in a small rented place in Kalispell, Montana. I was 29 back then, working nights at a distribution center just off Highway 2. My hours were weird, and I didn't really socialize much. That Friday, I had 3 days off in a row and figured I'd make the most of it. I decided to head out for a solo camping trip near the Flathead National Forest, a place I'd been to once before with a buddy a few years earlier. It wasn't an official campground, more like a forgotten pull-off tucked off a gravel road that hadn't been maintained in ages. The first time I'd gone, it was quiet and untouched. No traffic, no people. That's exactly what I wanted again. I packed up Friday morning. Tent, tarp, a sleeping bag good to 20 degrees, 2 coolers, one with food, the other with beer and water, a flashlight, spare batteries, a folding chair, a hatchet, a loaded .357 I kept in the glove compartment, and my old army backpack filled with basic gear. I wasn't some survivalist nut, but I grew up hunting in Idaho and knew my way around the woods. I drove out past the town of Swan Lake, then onto a Forest Service road with no markings, just a faded metal gate left open. After bouncing along for 20 minutes, I pulled off onto a narrow track barely wide enough for my truck. At the end was a tiny clearing just big enough to turn around in. Beyond that was dense lodgepole pine and old growth. I set up there. It was already cool out with those gray skies that don't seem to move. The wind had that sharp bite that only happens in Montana right before the snow really starts. I set up my tent facing the woods, not the road, and cleared a ring for a fire with my hatchet. I cracked a beer and sat back to enjoy the silence. No phone signal, no engine noise, just the occasional crow and the rustling of dry leaves. I didn't do much that evening. Started a fire, grilled 2 hot dogs, and drank a couple more beers. I didn't even bother exploring. I just sat in my camp chair, staring into the flames, thinking about how badly I needed a break from fluorescent lights and forklifts. When the fire burned low, I doused it properly with water from a jug and climbed into my sleeping bag with my headlamp clipped to the top of the tent. At some point in the night, I woke up needing to piss. I slid on my boots and stepped out into the cold. The sky had cleared up some. A half moon was just barely visible behind clouds. The woods looked silver and still. I walked 10 feet from the tent, did my business, and stood there listening. I always listen for a minute or two, call it a habit from hunting, just a way to stay aware of what's moving around you. That's when I noticed something. Not a noise, not exactly. More like the lack of one. Usually there's something. A breeze, a tree creaking, a distant bird. But this was still, completely still. Even the wind had stopped. Felt wrong. I couldn't explain it, but the moment I noticed it, I felt it in my chest. My body locked up like it was waiting for something to happen. I went back in the tent and zipped it shut tight. Laid there for a while in the dark, my headlamp turned off, just listening. I don't know how long I stayed like that, but eventually I drifted off. The next morning, everything seemed normal again. Sunlight was pushing through the trees, and the air smelled like pine needles and wet dirt. I made instant coffee and some oatmeal, then hiked around a bit behind the site. The woods were deep and layered. Moss, branches, fallen logs, and no sign of people. No tire tracks or wrappers.
No boat prints.
That's how I liked it. Around noon, I came back to camp to find something strange. My cooler, just the one with the food, was open. The lid was sitting upside down next to it. I hadn't touched it that morning. Inside, one of the vacuum pack steaks I brought was missing. The rest of the food, eggs, a stick of butter, 2 apples, was still there.
No claw marks, no tearing.
It wasn't ripped open like a bear or raccoon got into it. It looked opened, like a person had taken the lid off and grabbed just one thing. That set me on edge. I checked the ground around it. The forest floor was soft but dry. If someone had come through, there should have been a mark. But I didn't see anything clear. I did a sweep around the whole site. Nothing.
No prints.
No broken branches. Nothing stolen but that one steak. I started to wonder if I'd just misremembered. Maybe I'd eaten it already, or maybe it had fallen out. But the cooler had been latched when I packed it. And even if it had come loose, why just one steak? Why not the butter or the eggs? I tried to push it out of my mind. Maybe it was a fox or something small that managed to get lucky. Still, I kept my pistol on me the rest of the day. That night was colder. The temperature had dropped fast after sundown, and I made a fire early just to stay warm. I didn't drink that night, just sat by the fire with my coat zipped to my throat and my boots resting on a rock close to the flames. I kept glancing out at the woods. It was that same weird silence again. It wasn't completely soundless, but close. Just the occasional wind rustling dead leaves. I felt watched. That's the only way I can put it. Not from one direction either. Just that sense of being seen, even though no one's around. The fire cracked behind me, and I turned to it quick, thinking something had stepped near the ring. But it was just a stick collapsing in the flames. I stayed out longer than I should have. I didn't want to go into the tent. It felt safer outside where I could see in every direction. But I knew I had to sleep. I checked the area one last time with my flashlight, looked at every tree trunk, every shadow, then zipped myself inside and laid down with the .357 beside my pillow. Sometime in the middle of the night, I woke up again. Only this time, I wasn't sure what had woken me. I didn't have to piss. I wasn't cold. I just opened my eyes and felt something. I laid still, ears straining, my heart already going faster than it should have been. I was on my side, staring at the wall of the tent. I could see the faint light of the moon casting outlines of branches on the fabric. But as I watched, I saw something else. A shadow. Not a branch, not some blowing leaf. It was a figure. It stood perfectly still just outside the tent. I didn't move, not an inch. I just watched it through the thin fabric, trying to make sense of it. It was a shape, upright, maybe 6 feet tall. Shoulders, neck, head. I couldn't see details, just the mass of it. It didn't sway, didn't shift. It was completely still. Then, slowly, it bent at the waist, like it was crouching. Then I heard it, breathing. It was subtle, shallow, through the fabric. But I know what I heard. It wasn't a bear or a deer. It was human. Slow inhales, tight exhales. It was listening, or smelling. I stayed frozen for what felt like a full hour. I didn't blink. I didn't twitch. My hand hovered inches from the pistol, but I didn't touch it. I was afraid that any sound would make it react. Eventually, the shadow stood up straight again, and then it walked off.
No ruse. No sprint.
Just a slow walk back into the trees. I waited another hour after that, then another. Finally, when the faintest light started to rise through the trees, I unzipped the tent and stepped out. There were no footprints, just disturbed leaves in a few places where the weight had shifted the top layer. Not deep enough to track. I broke down camp in less than 10 minutes. Everything got thrown into the back of the truck. I didn't eat, didn't even brush my teeth. I just got the hell out of there. I drove straight to the next gas station, which was nearly an hour away. I sat there in the lot for a while, just breathing, trying to decide what the hell had happened. Was it a hiker? A local messing around? Somebody living in the woods? But the way it stood there, crouched, quiet, that wasn't normal. People don't do that. Not out in the woods where no one's around. Not silently watching a tent without making their presence known. Not standing still for that long. Over the next few weeks, I thought a lot about it. I searched online for similar stories. That's when I first heard the word skinwalker. A native friend I used to work with once mentioned it in a story, but I'd brushed it off at the time. Online, I read about people seeing things in the woods that looked human but weren't quite right. Hearing voices that mimicked people they knew. Strange behavior. Silence. Watching. I don't believe in monsters. I really don't. But I know what I saw, and I know how it made me feel. There was no ghost.
No howl.
No glowing eyes. But something out there. Stood just outside my tent in the middle of the night, watched me sleep, and walked away like it had done it 100 times before. I've never camped alone again, and I don't go near Flathead anymore. I was 29 years old when I decided to take some time off from work and head out into the countryside for a solo camping trip. It was early October of 2018. The weather was still holding on to the tail end of summer, but you could feel the edge of autumn in the air. Mornings were crisp, evenings cooler, and the leaves were just starting to change. I lived in Bristol at the time, and I worked as a freelance graphic designer, so my schedule was flexible enough that I could get away during the week when campsites and trails were less crowded. I didn't want to go too far from civilization, just far enough to feel alone. So I picked a place in the Cotswolds, near a small village called Shipton-under-Wickwood. It was a quiet area I'd heard of from a friend, full of green rolling hills, dense woods, and footpaths that weren't too popular. I figured it'd be the right kind of peaceful. I packed up my gear in my old Volkswagen Golf, tent, sleeping bag, stove, a few changes of clothes, basic food, water, and some odds and ends. Nothing fancy. I wasn't doing bushcraft or trying to test my survival skills. Just needed to clear my head and enjoy the outdoors a bit. I got to the spot I'd chosen late in the afternoon, a flat clearing nestled in a small patch of woodland, about a 20-minute walk from where I'd parked the car. The path leading in wasn't well trodden, but I'd found it easily enough using the OS Map app on my phone. I pitched the tent just before the sun began to dip behind the trees. The silence was thick, but not uncomfortable. Birds chirped every now and then, and there was the occasional rustle of leaves as squirrels darted about. It was peaceful. That first night was uneventful. I heated up a tin of beans on my little gas stove, ate by the dim orange light of my headlamp, and then crawled into my sleeping bag to read a bit before sleeping. No phone signal out there, which I expected, so I had downloaded a few books beforehand. I remember hearing an owl not long after I turned the light off. It was the last thing I remember before falling asleep. The next morning, I woke up early, around 6, to the sound of rain lightly tapping against the tent fabric. It was soft, barely more than a mist, but it gave the woods this pale gray atmosphere. Everything looked softer and stiller than the night before. I made coffee, ate a cold cereal bar, and decided to explore some of the trails nearby. I left most of my gear behind in the tent, just took a day pack with snacks, water, and a light jacket. I walked for hours. The area was beautiful, fields lined with dry stone walls, overgrown paths cutting through thickets of brambles, and quiet, shadowy woods where you couldn't hear much but your own breathing and the occasional bird overhead. It wasn't until I'd been out for maybe 3 or 4 hours that I saw someone for the first time. He was standing at the edge of the woods about 50 or 60 feet away from me, partially behind a tree. I didn't even notice him at first. It was just one of those moments where your brain suddenly registers that something is off, like something's watching you. I stopped walking and turned, and that's when I saw him. He was still not moving at all, almost blending in with the bark. He wore a long, dark brown coat that looked heavy and too warm for the weather. His face was pale, long, expressionless. His eyes looked wide from that distance. I couldn't make out much else, but the stillness of him, the way he stood without shifting even slightly, it made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. I wasn't sure what to do, but after maybe 15 seconds of us just staring at each other, I turned and started walking back the way I came. I didn't run, didn't want to show panic, but every step away from him felt slower than it should have been. I didn't look back until I was well around a bend in the trail, and when I did, there was no one there. I told myself it was just some local out walking, maybe a bit eccentric, maybe just curious. But there was something about the way he stood, like he'd been waiting. I got back to camp and decided I'd stay one more night. I'd already paid to park, and nothing had happened, really. It was just a weird moment. I was probably reading too much into it. That's what I told myself. That night, I didn't sleep well. I kept waking up at every little sound. I heard branches snap sometime around midnight. Not loud, just a quick snap, then silence. I stayed still in my bag, eyes wide open, breathing as quietly as I could. Then nothing, just wind, the kind of cold that seeps in through the floor of your tent. I eventually fell asleep, but it wasn't restful. The next day, I told myself I'd go on a shorter walk, maybe half an hour or so, just to stretch my legs. I stuck closer to camp this time, wandering along a narrow footpath that looped back around a few hundred meters away. I didn't see anyone, didn't hear anything unusual, but when I got back to my tent, I noticed something small and strange. One of the guy lines was unhooked, loose and slack, like it had been intentionally unclipped. I always double-checked those when I set up. They don't just come undone on their own, especially when the others were still tight. It was like someone had come by and undone it quietly. I stood there for a minute, looking around the woods in every direction. The quiet felt different now. Before, it had felt calm. Now it felt like something was holding its breath. I packed up most of my gear that afternoon, stuffed it into the car, and decided I'd just sleep one more night and head out early in the morning. I didn't start a fire that night, didn't want to draw attention. I sat in the tent and read, occasionally glancing at the fabric whenever I thought I heard a noise outside. I turned the light off early, just laid there in the dark, listening. It must have been around 3 in the morning when I woke up to the sound of slow footsteps outside the tent. Not animals, not the quick scurry of foxes or deer. These were slow, heavy, deliberate. Crunch, pause, crunch. I stopped breathing. My heart felt like it had jumped into my throat. I could feel every pulse in my body. The steps moved around the tent, slow, pacing. I didn't move. I didn't make a sound. I don't even think I blinked. Then the zipper on the front of the tent moved slightly. Not unzipped, just a twitch, like someone had pressed a finger to it. And then nothing. I laid there frozen for over an hour. No more steps.
No sounds.
Just the wind. I didn't sleep the rest of that night. As soon as it was light enough to see clearly outside, I threw everything into my backpack, took down the tent in record time, and bolted for the car. I didn't stop to eat, didn't stop to check the clearing. I just got in the car and drove. I didn't go back for months. When I finally did tell a friend about it, they asked me why I didn't report it. But what would I have said? That some guy stood outside my tent? That I heard footsteps? There was no crime, nothing I could prove. But I know what I felt. I know what I heard. And the part that stuck with me the most, the detail I didn't mention to anyone until much later, was that, in the faint morning light, As I'd walked back down the trail toward the car, I noticed something in the mud. A set of footprints. Large, deep. They hadn't been there the day before. They were pointed toward where my tent had been. I haven't camped alone since.